What if the most revealing moment of this entire story wasn't the retreat itself, but what happened after people walked out of that room and started comparing what they were promised to what they actually experienced? Because sometimes the truth doesn't come from headlines. It comes from that quiet realization when expectation and reality no longer match. The event had been positioned as something rare, something intimate, something almost impossible to access. A luxury women's retreat built around connection, presence, and direct interaction with Meghan Markle. The kind of experience that suggests more than just attendance. It suggests proximity. And in today's celebrity-driven world, proximity is not just valuable. It is everything. The messaging was carefully crafted. A full weekend. A shared space. Conversations that go beyond the surface. An opportunity to step into a more personal environment with one of the most recognizable figures in the world. That is what people believed they were stepping into when they booked their place, when they paid thousands, when they traveled across cities, and in some cases across countries. Because this wasn't marketed as a brief appearance. It was sold as an experience. And that distinction is where the entire story begins to shift. Reports from attendees began to surface, and while the structure of the event remained intact, luxury venue, curated programming, wellness activities, the centerpiece of the experience, the very element that defined its value, appeared in a way that felt different. Shorter. More contained. More structured than expected. The central appearance reportedly lasted around 2 hours. A session that included conversation, interaction, and photographs. On paper, that might still sound substantial. But when placed against the scale of what was promised, a full immersive weekend, it begins to feel like something else entirely. It begins to feel like a segment. And once that realization sets in, everything else starts to look different. Because the question naturally follows, what exactly were people paying for? Was it the weekend itself? The setting, the activities, the environment? Or was it the presence of Meghan Markle as the central figure around which everything else was built? And if that presence becomes limited, structured, and time-bound, does the value of the entire experience shift with it? That is where the tension begins. Because for many attendees, the expectation was not just access, it was continuity. The idea that the person whose name defined the retreat would remain a consistent part of it. Not just a highlight, but a presence woven throughout the experience. Instead, what emerged was a contrast. After her scheduled segment concluded, reports suggest that she left the venue, while the rest of the retreat continued. Workshops, sessions, activities, all still in place. The structure remained intact. But the focal point, the element that gave the event its identity, was no longer there. And that is not a small detail. That is the difference between a retreat built around a person and a retreat that features a person. At almost the same time, images began circulating that added another layer to the story. Prince Harry and Meghan attending a rugby match, seated in the stands, relaxed, visible, and very much present in a completely different setting. Now, on their own, those images are not unusual. Public figures attend events all the time. But when placed directly against the context of a retreat that hundreds of women had paid to attend, expecting a shared experience, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Because while one group was continuing a wellness program in a hotel setting, the central figure of that program had already moved on. And that contrast is what turned a private event into a public conversation. It wasn't just about time. It was about expectation. Because the language used to promote the retreat suggested something immersive, something ongoing, something personal. But the execution, at least according to attendee reactions, felt more like a scheduled appearance placed inside a larger framework. And once that perception takes hold, it spreads quickly. Online discussions began to pick up speed, not driven by outrage alone, but by confusion. People trying to understand the structure of the event. Trying to reconcile the marketing with the reality. Trying to answer a simple but powerful question. Was this exactly what was promised, or was it something slightly different presented in a much bigger way? This is where the story moves beyond a single event. Because what you are seeing here is not just a retreat. It is a model. A model that sits at the intersection of celebrity, branding, and experience-based economics. Where the value is not just in what is delivered, but in who is attached to it. Where pricing is influenced not by duration, but by proximity. where the idea of access can sometimes carry more weight than the actual structure of the event itself. And in that model, perception becomes everything. If people feel they received exactly what they expected, the model holds. If they feel a gap between what was promised and what was delivered, the entire structure begins to shift. That is exactly what started to happen here. Because once attendees begin sharing their experiences, once those experiences start to align, and once that alignment creates a consistent narrative, the story moves out of the venue and into the public space. And once it reaches that point, it no longer belongs to the event organizers. It belongs to perception. Another layer that added complexity to the situation was the environment itself. Reports of strict security procedures, controlled entry points, and tightly managed access created a setting that felt more structured than many expected for a wellness-focused retreat. For some, that level of control was understandable, given the profile of the individuals involved. For others, it created a disconnect. Because a space designed around openness, relaxation, and connection felt, at least in parts, heavily managed and restricted. And when that environment is paired with a limited appearance from the central figure, the contrast becomes even sharper. You start to see two different experiences happening at the same time. The experience that was promised, and the experience that was felt. And when those two begin to diverge, the story writes itself. Because at its core, this is not just about whether the retreat was good or bad, successful or unsuccessful. It is about alignment. Alignment between message and delivery, between expectation and reality, between what people believe they are stepping into and what they actually step into when they arrive. And that alignment, or lack of it, is what determines how an event like this is remembered. Not by its schedule, not by its location, but by the feeling people leave with when it is over. And right now, that feeling is exactly what is driving the conversation forward. If the first layer of this story is about expectation versus reality, then the second layer is where things become far more revealing. Because once you step inside the structure of the event itself, you begin to see that this wasn't just a retreat, it was a carefully controlled environment where every detail, from entry to interaction, followed a very specific design. And that design raises a different kind of question. Not what happened, but how it was built to happen. From the moment attendees arrived, one detail immediately stood out: the level of security. This wasn't the kind of light, welcoming check-in you might expect from a wellness retreat centered around openness and connection. Reports describe something far more intense. Controlled entry points. Physical checks. A process that, for some, felt closer to airport-level screening than a weekend focused on relaxation. Now, on one level, that can be explained easily. When a global figure like Meghan Markle is involved, security is not optional. It becomes part of the environment, whether people expect it or not. But here's where the contrast begins to matter. Because when you combine a highly controlled entry experience with messaging built around vulnerability, openness, and emotional connection, the atmosphere begins to feel divided. One part says, "This is a safe, open space." The other says, "This is tightly managed and monitored." And when those two signals exist at the same time, the experience changes. Because people don't just respond to what they are told. They respond to what they feel. Inside the venue, that same pattern continued. The central segment featuring Meghan was not chaotic or unpredictable. It was structured. A Q&A format, controlled interaction, defined timing, and a clear boundary around how long that engagement would last. Again, on its own, there is nothing unusual about that. Most high-profile appearances follow a similar structure. But context changes everything. When an event is sold as immersive, the expectation shifts from structured to continuous. From controlled moments to ongoing presence. And when what people receive is a carefully timed segment instead of a flowing experience, the difference becomes noticeable. Not immediately, but gradually. Because the audience begins to recalibrate what they are actually part of. Another detail that added to this recalibration was the presence of Prince Harry inside the event space. This is where interpretation begins to split, because the retreat had been framed as a women-centered environment, focused on shared experiences, female empowerment, and open dialogue among women. So when a highly recognizable male figure appears in that setting, it subtly shifts the dynamic. Not dramatically, but enough for people to notice. For some attendees and observers, it didn't matter. His presence could be seen as supportive, as part of the shared environment. But for others, it introduced a contradiction. A space presented as exclusively female suddenly felt more public, more mixed, and less aligned with the original concept. And once again, the theme repeats. Expectation versus experience. Then comes another layer, one that might seem small at first but becomes significant when placed into the bigger picture. The recurring presence of familiar figures within the same ecosystem. One name that repeatedly surfaced in discussions around the event was Marcus Anderson, a figure often associated with elite social networks and private member culture. Now, his presence alone is not unusual. People move within social circles. Connections overlap. But when the same individuals consistently appear across different events, different projects, and different environments, it begins to create a pattern. A pattern that suggests these spaces are not entirely spontaneous, but part of a broader network where relationships, opportunities, and visibility intersect. And that matters, because it changes how people interpret the event itself. Instead of seeing it as a standalone retreat, it begins to look like part of a larger ecosystem, one where access, influence, and familiarity are closely connected, where the same circle of individuals shapes multiple experiences, even when those experiences are presented as unique. This is where perception starts to evolve into narrative. Because once people begin to recognize patterns, they start connecting dots. And once those dots connect, the story becomes bigger than any single moment. Inside the retreat, the content of the conversation itself added another layer of complexity. The tone was described as personal, reflective, and focused on real-life pressures, public scrutiny, and emotional resilience. These themes are not new. In fact, they have appeared consistently across interviews, speeches, and public appearances by Meghan Markle over the years. And that consistency is where interpretation begins to divide. On one side, it creates familiarity. A clear message, repeated across platforms, that builds a recognizable identity. Themes of resilience, overcoming pressure, and navigating public life resonate with audiences because they are relatable, even if the context is unique. On the other side, repetition can create a different perception. It can begin to feel structured, planned, almost like a narrative framework that appears in multiple settings, rather than a spontaneous expression tied to a single moment. Neither interpretation is inherently right or wrong, but both exist at the same time. And that duality is what fuels discussion. Because people are not just reacting to what is said. They are reacting to how often they have heard it before. That is where the story expands beyond the retreat itself and into something broader, the construction of public identity. In today's media environment, identity is not just who someone is. It is how they are consistently presented across different platforms, events, and moments. And consistency, while powerful, also creates expectations. When people attend an event like this, they are not just expecting an experience. They are expecting a continuation of a narrative they already recognize. So when the delivery feels controlled, limited, or different from that expectation, the reaction becomes stronger. Because it is not just about one event. It is about alignment with an existing image. Another layer that began to surface in discussions was the structure of value itself. This retreat did not operate like a traditional wellness event where the value is evenly distributed across activities, sessions, and time. Instead, the value appeared to be concentrated, heavily centered around one individual. And that changes everything. Because when value is concentrated, expectations become concentrated as well. The rest of the experience becomes secondary, even if it is well-designed, well-executed, and meaningful in its own right. People are not measuring the yoga session. They are measuring the proximity. They are not evaluating the workshop. They are evaluating the presence. And once that becomes the metric, even small differences begin to feel amplified. That is why the duration of Meghan's appearance, roughly 2 hours, became the defining detail of the entire event. Not because 2 hours is inherently insufficient, but because it was being measured against a different standard. A weekend, an immersion, an experience built around presence. And when those two measurements do not align, the conversation naturally shifts. By the time all these layers come together, the security, the structure, the presence of familiar figures, the narrative consistency, and the concentrated value, you begin to see the retreat not just as an isolated event, but as a case study. A case study in how modern celebrity-driven experiences operate, how they are built, how they are perceived, and how quickly perception can change when even one element feels misaligned. Because at the end of the day, people are not just paying for what happens. They are paying for what they believe will happen. And when that belief shifts, even slightly, it changes everything that follows. If the structure of the event explains how it was built, then the next layer explains why it felt the way it did. Because once you step back from individual moments and start looking at the broader system behind it, a very different picture begins to emerge. This was never just a retreat. It was part of a much larger ecosystem. And that ecosystem operates on a very specific principle. Value is not created through duration, but through proximity. Not through how long something lasts, but through how close you get to the person who defines it. In that model, time becomes secondary. Presence becomes everything. And that is exactly where the shift begins. Because when attendees paid thousands to be there, they were not just investing in a schedule of activities. They were investing in the idea of access. Access to Meghan Markle as a figure, as a voice, as someone whose personal narrative has been built across years of global visibility. That is what gave the event its price. That is what gave it its weight. But here's where the model becomes fragile. Because when access is the product, even a small limitation in that access becomes magnified. A 2-hour appearance is no longer just a segment. It becomes the defining metric of the entire experience. Everything else, every workshop, every session, every carefully planned activity, begins to orbit around that single point of comparison. And that comparison is what drives perception. This is where the conversation begins to move beyond logistics and into psychology. Because what people felt at that retreat was not just based on what happened. It was based on what they expected to happen before they even arrived. Expectation is not neutral. It is constructed through marketing language, through branding, through imagery, and through the reputation of the person at the center of it all. When an event is described as immersive, personal, and transformative, the mind begins to fill in the gaps. It imagines continuity, presence, and depth, long before the first session even begins. So when reality introduces structure, limitation, and timing, the contrast feels sharper than it actually is. And that contrast becomes the story. What makes this situation even more interesting is how it fits into a much broader trend, the rise of the celebrity experience economy. This is a space where events are not just about content. They are about identity. About stepping into a curated environment that reflects the image of the person leading it. In this case, the retreat was not just about wellness. It was about stepping into the world of Meghan Markle. Her themes, her messaging, her perspective on resilience, pressure, and personal growth. These are ideas that have appeared consistently across interviews, speeches, and public appearances. And when they are brought into a live setting, they carry a certain expectation that they will feel more direct, more personal, more unfiltered. But here's the complexity. When those same themes appear again, in a structured format, within a controlled environment, they begin to feel different. Not necessarily less meaningful, but more familiar. More aligned with a known narrative rather than a new discovery. And this is where interpretation begins to split again. For some, that consistency is reassuring. It reinforces identity. It creates a clear message that carries across platforms and experiences. It makes the event feel like a continuation of something larger. For others, it creates a different reaction. It starts to feel repetitive, predictable, even curated. Not in a negative sense necessarily, but in a way that highlights structure over spontaneity. And when people attend an event expecting something raw, something unscripted, that perception can shift their entire experience. Because they are no longer just listening. They are comparing. This is where another layer of the story becomes important, the idea of narrative framing. In modern media, especially around high-profile figures, narratives are not built in isolation. They are reinforced over time, across multiple appearances, through consistent themes and messaging. For Meghan Markle, Those themes have often centered around resilience, overcoming public scrutiny, and navigating personal challenges under global attention. These are powerful ideas. They resonate with people. They create emotional connection. But when those themes appear repeatedly, in different settings, they begin to form a recognizable pattern. And patterns change perception. Because once an audience recognizes a pattern, they start to anticipate it. They start to expect certain topics, certain tones, certain emotional beats. And when those expectations are met, the experience feels aligned, but not necessarily surprising. And in a setting like a high-priced retreat, surprise matters. Discovery matters. The feeling of experiencing something new, something unique, something that cannot be replicated elsewhere, that is often what people believe they are paying for. So when the experience feels familiar instead of exclusive, the value begins to shift. Another element that adds to this shift is comparison. Not necessarily direct, but contextual. In the same space of celebrity-driven events, different figures operate under different models. Some focus on scale, large audiences, lower pricing, broader access. Others focus on exclusivity, smaller groups, higher pricing, more intimate settings. This retreat clearly positioned itself in the second category. High price, limited access, premium experience. But with that positioning comes a different level of expectation. People are not just expecting quality. They are expecting depth, time, presence, a sense that what they are part of cannot be easily replicated. And when any part of that expectation feels reduced, even slightly, it becomes noticeable. Not because the event failed, but because the standard was set so high. This is why the discussion around this retreat has become so layered. It is not just about whether the event was good or bad. It is about how it was framed, how it was experienced, and how those two elements interacted with each other. Because at the center of it all is a very simple but powerful question. What was actually being sold? Was it a weekend of wellness? Or was it access to a person? And if it was access, how much access is enough to fulfill that promise? That is the question that continues to drive the conversation. Because once you understand that, everything else begins to fall into place. The pricing, the structure, the reactions, the online discussions, they all connect back to that single point. Expectation, and whether or not it was met. And as this story continues to unfold, that question doesn't go away. It becomes stronger. If the earlier layers explained how the retreat was structured and why it felt the way it did, then this next layer is where the story becomes far more revealing. Because this is where perception stops being individual and starts becoming collective. And once perception becomes collective, it no longer belongs to the people who created the event. It belongs to the audience. Because what began as scattered reactions from attendees quickly evolved into something more organized, more consistent, and far more powerful. A shared narrative forming in real time. Not driven by one voice, but by many voices noticing the same patterns, asking the same questions, and arriving at similar conclusions. And when that happens, the story takes on a life of its own. The central tension that began to dominate discussions was no longer about logistics or scheduling. It shifted into something much deeper. The gap between how the retreat was positioned and how it was experienced. Not in a dramatic sense, but in a subtle, accumulating way where each detail added another layer to the same underlying feeling. A luxury, immersive, personal weekend versus a structured, time-bound, high-profile appearance inside a broader program. That contrast may seem small when viewed from a distance, but when experienced directly, especially after significant financial investment, it becomes much more noticeable. Because people are not just evaluating what they received. They are evaluating it against what they believed they were stepping into. And belief is powerful. Once that belief is challenged, even slightly, it changes how every detail is interpreted. The security becomes more restrictive. The structure becomes more controlled. The duration becomes more limited. Even elements that might otherwise feel neutral begin to carry weight. Because they are now being viewed through a different lens. This is where the conversation begins to expand beyond the event itself and into the way modern audiences interpret authenticity. In today's environment, authenticity is not just about what is said. It is about how consistent that message feels across different contexts. For Meghan Markle, the public identity that has developed over time is built around openness, vulnerability, and sharing personal experience. These are themes that resonate deeply, particularly in spaces centered around wellness and personal growth. But here's where it becomes complicated. When those same themes are delivered within a highly structured, tightly controlled environment, some audiences begin to feel a disconnect. Not necessarily because the message is insincere, but because the setting feels managed. And when a message of openness is delivered within a controlled framework, the audience starts to question how much of what they are seeing is spontaneous versus designed. That question doesn't need to be answered directly. It simply needs to exist. Because once it exists, it shapes perception. And perception, once shaped, spreads quickly. This is where the digital layer amplifies everything. Social media, commentary channels, and online discussions do not just report events, they interpret them. They compare experiences, highlight contrasts, and often simplify complex situations into clear narratives that can be easily shared. In this case, one of the most common narratives that began to emerge was built around a single idea: over-promised, under-delivered. Now, whether that interpretation is fully accurate or not is almost secondary at this stage. Because once a narrative like that begins to circulate, it becomes a reference point. People start viewing the event through that frame, even if they were not there themselves. And that is where the impact multiplies. Because the story is no longer being told by attendees alone. It is being reshaped by observers. Another layer that strengthened this narrative was comparison. Not direct comparison, but symbolic comparison. Cultural references began to appear in discussions, drawing parallels between this retreat and other high-profile events where expectation did not align with delivery. Not because the scale or intent was the same, but because the pattern felt familiar. High price, strong branding, a promise of exclusivity, and then an experience that, for some, felt more limited than anticipated. This pattern, once recognized, becomes easy to communicate. It becomes a shorthand. A way for people to explain what they are seeing without needing to go into every detail. And that shorthand spreads faster than nuance ever can. At the same time, another narrative continued to run alongside it, one that focused not on the event itself, but on the broader public image of Meghan Markle. The idea that her messaging often returns to similar themes, resilience, public scrutiny, emotional pressure, became part of the conversation once again. And this is where interpretation becomes layered. For some, this consistency strengthens her identity. It creates a clear, recognizable voice that carries across different platforms. It reinforces the idea of someone who has faced challenges and continues to speak about them openly. For others, that same consistency begins to feel like repetition, a pattern that appears in interviews, speeches, and now events like this retreat. And when that pattern is recognized, it changes how new appearances are received. They are no longer viewed as isolated moments, but as extensions of an ongoing narrative. And that shifts the experience. Because instead of discovering something new, the audience feels like they are revisiting something familiar. That feeling, familiarity versus exclusivity, is at the heart of this entire situation. Because in a premium, high-cost environment, exclusivity is not just about access. It is about uniqueness. The sense that what you are experiencing cannot be easily replicated elsewhere. That it exists only in that moment, in that space, with that group of people. So when the experience begins to feel like a continuation rather than a unique event, the perceived value begins to change. Not dramatically, but enough to be noticed. Another important factor in how this story evolved is the role of selective information. Reports suggesting that certain attendees may have been screened or that specific individuals were not allowed to participate added another layer of complexity. If true, it introduces the idea that the audience itself may have been curated. And that changes perception again. Because a curated audience suggests a curated environment. An environment where variables are controlled, where interactions are managed, and where the overall experience is shaped in advance. For some, that level of control is expected. For others, it raises questions about authenticity. Because the more controlled an environment feels, the less spontaneous it appears. And spontaneity, especially in spaces centered around personal connection, is often what people value most. By this stage, the retreat was no longer just an event. It had become a case study in how modern celebrity-driven experiences are interpreted, evaluated, and ultimately remembered. Not just based on what happens inside the venue, but based on how those experiences are communicated, compared, and discussed afterward. Because once the story leaves the room, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes narrative. And narrative does not operate on facts alone. It operates on feeling, on interpretation, on the collective sense of whether something aligned with what people expected it to be. And right now, that alignment, or lack of it, is what continues to drive this story forward. Because the more people analyze it, the clearer one thing becomes. This was never just about a retreat. It was about perception. And perception, once formed, is incredibly difficult to change. If everything so far has been about structure, perception, and interpretation, then this final layer is where the story settles into something much clearer. Because once you connect all the pieces, the retreat stops looking like an isolated moment and starts looking like a reflection of a much bigger system. A system where image, access, and expectation are constantly interacting with each other. And sometimes, not perfectly. Because when you step back and look at everything together, the marketing language, the pricing, the structure of the appearance, the reactions from attendees, and the wider online discussion, you begin to see a pattern that goes beyond one weekend in Sydney. You begin to see how modern celebrity experiences are built, and more importantly, where they become vulnerable. At the center of that vulnerability is a simple imbalance. Expectation rises faster than delivery. And once that gap appears, even slightly, it becomes the defining feature of the entire experience. This is what happened here. Not because the retreat lacked effort, or organization, or intention, but because the idea of what it was supposed to be grew larger than what it actually became. And when that happens, people don't just evaluate what they received. They evaluate what they feel was missing. That emotional calculation is what shapes the final memory. Because people rarely remember schedules. They remember contrasts. They remember the difference between what they imagined and what they experienced. They remember the moment they realized those two things were not perfectly aligned. And once that realization happens, it becomes the anchor for everything else. This is where the role of Meghan Markle becomes even more central, not just as a participant in the event, but as the defining force behind its entire value structure. Her presence is not an addition to the experience. It is the experience. Everything else, every session, every activity, every carefully designed element, exists around that central point. And that creates both power and pressure. Because when one person defines the value of an entire event, every minute of their presence carries weight. Every absence becomes noticeable. Every transition becomes meaningful. And every decision, whether to stay, to leave, to engage, or to step away, becomes part of the audience's evaluation. That level of focus is difficult to sustain. And in this case, it is exactly what shaped the outcome. The broader takeaway here is not just about this retreat, but about the model it represents. The celebrity-driven experience economy is built on a delicate balance between access and exclusivity, between structure and spontaneity, between branding and authenticity. When that balance holds, the experience feels seamless. When it shifts, even slightly, people notice. And once they notice, they start asking questions. What was this really about? Was it a wellness retreat, or was it a curated appearance built around a specific narrative? Was the value in the content, or in the proximity? Was the experience designed for connection, or for presentation? These questions don't necessarily have one clear answer, but the fact that they are being asked is what matters. Because once an event moves from experience to analysis, it changes how it is remembered. It is no longer just something people attended. It becomes something people dissect, compare, and discuss. And that discussion is what gives the story its longevity. Another important element in this final phase is the role of repetition. The themes presented during the retreat, resilience, public scrutiny, emotional pressure, are not new. They are part of a broader narrative that has been consistently associated with Meghan Markle across multiple platforms. And consistency, as we've seen, is a double-edged sword. It builds identity, but it also builds expectation. When audiences recognize a pattern, they begin to anticipate it. And when they anticipate it, the experience shifts from discovery to confirmation. They are no longer hearing something for the first time. They are hearing it again, in a new setting. And that changes how it feels. Because in high-value, exclusive environments, people are not just looking for confirmation. They are looking for something they cannot get anywhere else. Something unrepeatable. Something that exists only in that moment. So when the experience aligns more with an existing narrative than with a new one, the sense of exclusivity begins to soften. Not disappear, but soften enough to be noticed. This is where the retreat ultimately lands. In that space between intention and interpretation, between what was designed and how it was received. And that space is where most modern events are judged. Not by what they were meant to be, but by how they felt to the people who experienced them. And in this case, the feeling is what continues to drive the conversation. Because for some, this was a well-organized high-end event that delivered exactly what it promised, a structured appearance within a broader wellness experience. For others, it was something different. A gap between branding and reality, between the idea of immersion and the reality of limited presence. Both interpretations exist, and both are shaping how this story is being told. But here's the part that matters most, and this is where everything comes together. This was never just about a retreat. It was about trust. Trust in messaging. Trust in branding. Trust in the idea that what is presented will match what is delivered. And once that trust is questioned, even slightly, it changes everything that follows. Because trust is not built in a single moment, but it can shift in one. So now the question turns to you, because this is where your perspective becomes part of the story. When you look at everything, the pricing, the structure, the limited appearance, the wider narrative, do you see this as a misunderstood format that was interpreted differently than intended? Or do you see it as a clear example of how modern celebrity experiences can sometimes prioritize image over substance? I want you to think about that carefully, because there isn't a simple answer. And that's exactly what makes this conversation so powerful. If you've stayed with me this far, you're already seeing the deeper layers behind what looked like a simple event on the surface. So go ahead and share your view, because the discussion around this is only getting bigger, and your perspective adds to it. And if you want more breakdowns like this, where we don't just follow headlines but actually unpack what's happening underneath them, make sure you stay connected. Because the next story takes this idea even further, and it might completely change how you see events like this in the future.